So off we go. Let's enjoy ourselves. Cool. All right. Perfect. We are live today. We've got our attendees coming in. Just perfect. Thank you for joining us. And we'll just give it a moment for people to join the session before we launch into the content and introduce our panel today. All right. Here we go. I can see some names that I recognized from the last session. It's good to have you all here. So on that, welcome to today's session. So today's open conversation is on the specific needs of farmers with Mariana Vasconcelos and Matt Foley. And so some of the questions that we'll be answering are what effects is the pandemic having on farmers? What can we learn, and how can we seize the chance to build more inclusive and smallholder empowering food systems? And we'll also talk about the different regions of the world where we are and what we've seen over there. So today's conversation is hosted by Mariana and Matt. So let me briefly introduce them. So Mariana is the daughter of farmers. She's the founder of Agrosmart, a previous TFF finalist team, and she's also a Forbes Under 30 awardee. And Matt, who leads the Combine AgriFood Incubator and assists in the management of the venture portfolio for Invest Nebraska, is also the North America TFF regional coordinator. And with that, over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Marie, and thank you for the introduction. Mariana, great to be with you this morning. It's been a while since we've actually had a chance to chat, and for me, this is a really cool experience because when I think back to the first times I was involved with TFF, it was actually kind of working alongside you. We were both challenge participants in the first year. So kind of neat to reunite this group, and we'll have some time on the back half of the hour to talk with additional people around the world. So this is kind of the ultimate TFF engagement because we've got all these different time zones. It's going to be neat to hear lots of different activities and new perspectives that we're seeing for farmer needs around the world. So great to be with you today, Mariana.
Well, for me too, Matt. It is funny, how time flies, and I think now you can contribute with us with your different perspectives from like being an entrepreneur in the challenge, now being in the investment side. So I'm really curious to learn from your perspective. So I think like the first thing I would like to ask you is to have like your introductory vision on how the pandemic is influencing farmers in North America, like what has been the major impacts.
Yeah, no, completely. And I think just for context of this conversation, so located in the United States and specifically in the Midwest. So when I'm talking about the interaction that I have in my work with producers is very much often grain farmers, row crop farmers in the U.S. Get a sprinkling of other things, but it'll be interesting how that contrasts with your perspectives as well as other people we'll talk to. But it's been very much a strain on local supply chains. So we see that in both the grain industry, but also very much in animal protein. From a health perspective, a lot of farmers, relatively speaking, are doing pretty well, obviously compared to urban settings in this COVID pandemic, because as they would joke, they've been socially distancing their entire lives, their entire careers, because they're very remote, rural settings. That being said, when you look at some of the production and processing facilities for pork, swine, the beef industries, that's where some of the rural settings of the U.S. have actually seen some significant outbreaks. So really an opportunity to highlight, all right, what are ways that these industries can evolve and improve some of the sustainable practices that they've always kind of known this is something we're going to need to improve on. And now it's highlighted because the working conditions are pretty tough. So that's kind of the first thing that comes to mind. Secondarily is commodity prices are real tough right now. And I'm sure you're seeing this also in Brazil, but the squeeze and the margins in an industry that was notoriously tough, a farmer is buying wholesale and selling retail. it's present even more. So it's a tough time for sure.
Now, that's very interesting to hear. I think here, like, even though the margins are getting lower, like the soybean farmers, like the raw crops farmers, they are seeing a good scenario because of the dollar. Like the dollar got stronger, so with the exchange rate, they're being very well recompensated. So like a loss of margin and pricing is being compensated by the exchange rate. So they are like in a good scenario right now, like being able to choose to invest now and adopt more technology and increase production, while other scenarios are not as positive. Besides raw crops like in soybeans and corn, like when you look to sugarcane, it's a sector that is being highly affected. Brazil is the largest exporter in the world, and with the low prices of the oil industry, it has been affecting ethanol, and therefore like in many of the sugarcane mills are going through financial issues. So it's a time where we say technologies are being put into proof to who has actually a capacity to aggregate value for farmers and bring return investments, and who are like just nice to have. So I think the industry will prioritize investments and only stay with technologies that actually bring them cost savings so they can survive the crisis. When we look into high value crops, we are also facing issues with flowers and fruits. Like developing countries such as Brazil usually have poor infrastructure and like very poor cold chains. So like many times the food's not arriving on time to the big cities, to the big centers, and there is a lot of losses in the way. Like many farmers, especially organic and smallholders, lost their income because they're not being able to sell, because their consumers are not going to the markets anymore. They're home, and many times they cannot make this transportation. And in the flower sector, it has been hit hard because like no one buys flowers anymore. It's like not a priority anymore. So I think like we have very different scenarios within the same crisis. But in general, I think the main aspects that are affecting the farmers here is they are learning to be digital. Like it has been a transformation already. It has been an impulse, but now the ag techs are not the only ones. The traditional industry, the traditional input companies, they are not able to visit farms anymore. So they have to do digital sales. They have to talk to them in Zoom, in WhatsApp, and therefore is everyone pushing the farmer that now is the time to digitalize. So like there is a higher demand for technology. Many times it's not able to consolidate itself now because some startups need to deliver locally or like to train farmers locally, but little by little, like they're being forced to learn and to engage with us online. So I think there's the good side and the bad side as well. I think also the community, and I think that's something I would like to know from the US perspective. We have like an international supply chain. We export a lot. And we see how important Latin America is in the global supply chain, while many countries didn't worry about that before. Now they start worrying because they have to buy our food. So I don't know, are you seeing in the US any movement towards like a more local supply chain and this kind of things?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think there's definitely a recurring, whether it's just what I see on social media or more just the reality of for the first time, a lot of people seeing an empty grocery store shelf makes them stop and think of, wow, for probably my entire life, I've never really had to wonder, can I really trust the supply chain? Is this going to be reliable when I show up to my grocery store? What is going to be there? What is not? And so in one sense, hopefully it's a little more a chance to stop and be especially appreciative of what has worked, but also as you think about, say the Midwest, where a lot of our produce or especially crops are imported from across country around the world, those strains have really been tested right now. And there's a huge, I don't want to say pushback, but there's a huge opportunity for, all right, what can be a little more localized, and how will that impact the direct consumer need for, they want to know where their food is coming from, and what does that mean for their desired diet and when they go to the grocery store and are filling up their cart. And I think that actually is a great trend to follow as more and more younger producers are taking over the operation. And there are already some great trends of regenerative agriculture and no-till farming and cover crops. And then couple that with, now they can point to this as an example, is we want to serve you. We want to be more active in your farmers market and local grocery stores. And I know that will take some time, but in the U.S., I definitely see that as kind of a silver lining for us. People recognize, all right, we can't take this for granted, whether it be grain, fruits and vegetables, or the meat they eat every day. Very important to recognize that we can't take it for granted. And maybe you're seeing that the same. And it sounds like it'd be tough because some of the actual markets in Brazil are actually shut down physically. But it's definitely difficult.
I completely agree. And on the trend of sustainability, I think like also before the pandemic, this was the area of action, right? Like if you look into Davos and the big conventions and the corporations, everyone said, okay, now it's time to rethink our food chains, to rethink how we can be climate resilient and how can we build a different sustainable ways of producing food. And that has been like a growing movement here in Brazil, in parts because of the food and beverage multinationals started setting more strict sustainability goals and putting rules and tools for the farmers to start producing a new standards. So like many of them have water footprint, carbon footprints, specific goals. Like many of these companies adhere to the 1.5 degrees pact. So therefore, like they had to bring downstream to the farmer itself tougher goals, and they're restructuring their supply chains. If I'm not wrong, like even Danone had made a commitment for a regenerative agriculture supply chain for the milk until 2030. So we are seeing more and more engagement of those corporations, and that's really important for us to be able to bring technology and change agricultural systems across all kinds of farmers, right? Like including in the smallholder sector. And when we look here in Brazil, like even though many people will say like Brazil is a large operation in agriculture, they're not as sustainable. Like we actually have one of the most sustainable practices in the world, like a very strict code of deforestation and how the farmers should proceed. And we are leading some of these trends. Our main research institution, that is Embrapa, they are like one of the largest in the world for tropical agriculture. They created a project for carbon neutral meat that combines different ecosystems, and it has been super like calling attention from farmers because it's not only sustainable, but it also makes it financially more sustainable. And therefore there is a drive to adopt. And we also have the case of our fellow TFF friend Felipe with Renature, like in being able to deploy many regenerative agriculture projects in Amazonia and one of these large corporations. So I'm really happy to see, and I think this moment of pandemic makes us think that like before it was already a plan, but now it's a reality that we need to be sustainable and we need to create resilient supply chains.
Yeah, no, you're summarizing it very well, because at the end of the day, if it's not a business decision, it won't really have any legs to it, because it can sound great and it can get great PR, but it can only be implemented, like you said, if there are actual margins to it. So are you seeing any new, whether, I don't want to say new, but any increased uses of different revenue streams? I know there's in the US, there's increased talks of using carbon markets and carbon credits and different ways that farmers can leverage some of their improved practices, but also just new revenue streams for them as a business. Because if the continual reliance on commodity prices, I know you'll see it in Brazil too as well, you're already seeing it, there's definitely a lot of nervousness of just waiting for an improvement, whether it be a trade deal or an ethanol change, to turn that around. Do you see any new trends that excite you there?
Yes, so I think like one, there's this decommoditization of agriculture and how like farmers are starting to see that they can be rewarded by producing well. Indigo arrived very strongly here last year, like making deployments together with biological products and technology to help farmers produce more with a premium contract. And that's a trend we are seeing, like that more and more the corporations are willing to pay more to the farmer if they're sustainable. And that can also be seen in the consumer side, where like many brands are investing in having a food with stories, like that they can tell the traceability and they can tell how was that produced. So they are able to capture value. Like if you look to Brazil, Argentina, like we are countries that export a lot of commodities. like you said, and then the value is captured by Germany, by the US, and so on. And now I think we are learning little by little, having groups here that are willing to process it, to pack it, and tell its story, so we can export already aggregated value. And carbon markets is for sure a trend. Agrosmart joined in January the Nature Climate Solutions Alliance from the World Economic Forum, that is like working on proposing in the COP26 that was postponed now because of the pandemic, but a private sector proposition for regulation of carbon markets, because we believe for sure that will be a thing. If farmers will play a role in neutralizing carbon, like even by soil sequestration or keeping forests up and this kind of things, they should be rewarded for it. Colombia did a work and was able to create like a huge market already doing internal rules. But what we want is like to cooperate so we can have a global market that will really increase opportunities. And Brazilian government have been very keen on supporting that movement. So I'm really excited about that. I think it will come soon. Today, it's more like on the, I would say, in the minds of the entrepreneurs or the government, like trying to create an environment that is good enough for farmers to adopt it. Like farmers are still looking at the precision ag, the normal day-to-day technologies to improve yield, and of course, be some sustainable and tell the story, but the path will be to the carbon markets.
Mm-hmm. You brought up an interesting point that I kind of want to dig into more, and this might be two parallel stories for two different hemispheres here, but you mentioned how COVID might actually act as kind of an accelerant for digital ag and connecting a lot of farmers to hop on a Zoom call or talk to an agronomist 100% virtually. That all sounds great, but in the US, there's a huge question of what does the logistics look like? How does rural broadband implemented, whether it's for pure communications or out in the field for Internet of Things and connectivity? This is what you deal with every day with Agrosmart, so you know it probably better than anybody down in Brazil. But as far as connectivity, what trends are actually helping producers that you're working with, and do we still have a long ways to go?
We have a long way to go. There is improvement since we started. Like there was nothing. That's why we create like our own network and this kind of things. Today, I think satellite connectivity have improved a lot. So like it's cheaper and many devices are able to use it to send the data. We are using it in large scale. There was also investment from private sector to bring like Sigfox, LoRa, and now more and more the telecoms companies are interested. There was this interest before, but we really felt like once they actually was going to deploy something, they did nothing, because everyone thinks agriculture is a great opportunity. But if you look in IoT devices, comparing farms to cities is just like so different. And the value is on when you capture value from the use of data, right? Like on the intelligence side and so on. So we saw like many times a failing attempt of telecom companies to enter with solutions in the market. And I think now for the first time they understood it. And we have like team that is like Telco Italia in Latin America, making investments in deploying private 4G towers for cooperatives or big, large agriculture groups. But they understood they're not coming anymore just with a telco solution. They are bringing the combos, they're distributing the technology together, and they're creating financial incentives within that scope for farmers to adopt technology. So I feel more confident that this time the telcos will be able to expand and invest in rural connectivity. Because they are able to bring up a larger package and capture value from different sides. In terms of Brazil specifically, like the government created a committee for discussing connectivity in agriculture. There is a law to be approved in the Senate that is actually not going very well. So anyone that is Brazilian and watching this and can vote, it's a provisory measurement from the government to be able to allocate part of the money for agriculture credit and so on into technology. And one of these technologies is connectivity. So like they're trying to create a framework where they can actually find resources to support farmers' financing of ag techs and connectivity. And I think that's a proactive behavior that like for very long, everyone kept waiting on what was going on. But it's good to tell here that this is not an exclusive problem from Brazil and developing countries. Even in the US, until a few years ago, like almost half of Syngenta user base didn't have connectivity in the whole field. Because we have both large countries in Brazil and the US, many times companies stay in their comfort zone because the connected market is good enough or it's big enough. But we really, if we want to change and if we want to generate impact, we really need to push to be able to guarantee that everyone will have access to the technology and everyone can improve their practices.
Yeah, no, definitely would echo a lot of those sentiments. I think there's a lot of communities that still feel very frustrated by this, and sometimes maybe even more so as they see, yeah, a LoRa network would support a number of our devices in the field, but when we get back to our own personal homes, can we send an email? I mean, can we even get general connection in that capacity? So I think what could be highlighted for a lot of remote workers outside of agriculture, as you see a lot of potential dissemination in the traditional tech hubs as more and more companies are allowing them to work remotely. Hopefully that could spur it along, and hopefully agriculture is leading the way, but there could be some other motivations to allow people to work remotely for other companies and other industries. So
I think that will prove that right now, right? Like I'm in a farm today, and like I had to be able to hire an internet to come work because like 5 years ago there was nothing available, and today like we were able to convince the company to put internet so I could work from here, like not necessarily in the field operations but with the company. So I'm sure like the way home office perspectives will change around the world will help farmers to get access.
yeah, and I think that's what we're looking at is our generation is obviously farming could be their primary income, but they're very much used to having side projects or hobbies or like I said, other revenue streams that might not necessarily be primarily dependent on agriculture. So then having that connectivity is an absolute must, let alone the social impact and connecting and staying in touch with family and friends. Absolutely just as critical as anything else. So I think you're right.
And as like connectivity, and we just mentioned like about capacity of investing, right? Like we cannot deploy technology and we cannot make the world connected if we don't have investment from somewhere. Maybe carbon credits could be used for that as well, right? But since you are working with Invest Nebraska, how you are seeing like the investment side impact on the ag techs and biotechs with the COVID?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, as far as an immediate impact, we haven't seen a drastic drop in deal flow. I mean, as an investor that has really professionally only worked in the good economic times, so to speak, it is interesting to hear anecdotal stories of what the early stage investment time was like in the Great Recession, and how it often acted as kind of a natural barrier where the deal flow may have been less, but the companies that were still coming forward for investment were as stronger than ever. Because if you can start a company in these rough times and can get to the point where you're growing steadily and strongly, really even more power to you. So it's going to be interesting to see. I think what will be interesting to track is how does fund creation impact it in the next couple of years, where there's a lot of fund managers and private funds in general that are in a good position to deploy capital for the next 12 months. But as far as future creation and deploying capital 24 months from now, could we see a slow in activity into early stage venture that directly impacts ag tech and food technology? So what we're seeing in Nebraska is still, I mean, a lot of our time is managed on the portfolio and making sure the companies that we've backed previously are doing okay. But I think there's a good possibility that we could see a slight pullback for new fund creation and the amount of dollars that has gone into it as an asset class.
Interesting. Here, like on our end, we have seen a first fear from investors, right? So like they really took the time to focus on their portfolio and making sure they are safe, and freezing decision making for investments for the next 1-2 months. In the beginning, I think everyone was waiting to see how the
Oh no, the tech has let us down.
I was hoping that wasn't me.
Let me as much.
Marie, you muted, by the way.
Thank you. I was just going to say, I've just Mute Mariana.
Hmm.
Sorry. Tech. Right. So, sorry about that, but tech things happen. But so maybe we'll jump into the question that has just come into the chat from Lucas, who is also based in Brazil. And so he's actually asked, Matt, if you could take this. How do you feel about the first contact with farmers? There is a general behavior that they must do that first contact physical instead of online. Is that still true? And is that maybe changing, that you can reach out to farmers online as opposed to in person?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and this might be a bit of a generational answer where I'm optimistic it is changing. I think there still is some, whether it be certain sales practices or certain relationships, that the understanding is, yes, you're going to come out and this is because I want tailored specific advice or tailored specific treatment. I want your boots on the ground. I want you out here working with me and looking at my operation. That being said, as data collection and data sharing becomes a little more widely understood and accepted, the producers themselves are understanding, all right, you can pull this up on your own laptop or iPad and understand exactly what we're looking at. If it saves me time, or we can do this purely over email or just in the morning over coffee remotely, let's make it efficient. We can jump right to it. So I think specifically, if you think about, so say FBN, Farmers Business Network, they've seen that a lot of their relationships with producers, it actually still does need to be in person. As strong as a digital presence as they have, they still have moved toward local hubs, and they want in-person relationships where you can shake someone's hand. I don't know if maybe shaking hands will be around for the next 12 months, but you know what I mean, is that there's still that value of, all right, we need someone that can meet them in person and really talk them through this situation. That being said, if you think about some of the agronomy practices, I think it's fair to say as satellite imagery and more digital connection gets better, that could actually move to be further, I don't want to say distance, but it's a little more communicative on a remote basis.
Perfect, thank you. I'm loving all the action in the chat, guys. If you have questions for us, you can also put them in the Q&A, which is easier for us to keep a track of so that it's not lost in the chat, but do keep going with it because I'm loving what I'm seeing. Welcome back, Mariana.
Thank you. We were talking about connectivity and then we experienced real-time challenges.
Exactly.
We're just doing a case study on rural broadband.
Do you want to continue telling us what you were telling us? I don't think you got
I don't
very
know what
far.
was the last thing you guys heard.
To be honest, you went a little bit robotic, which is rather entertaining. So to be honest, I forgot. So maybe
no worries. No, I can repeat fast. I said like there was a short-term slowdown in investments here in Brazil for startups in general, as investors decided to wait to see the impact and focus on their portfolio companies. But what we have seen, like against the expectations, was that agtechs are growing instead of being directly affected. There's more demand because farmers cannot count, for example, on migration for harvesting, or like they need to remote monitoring because they have to be in quarantine. So like the demand is increasing for technology, and we expect the movement of the investments to come back faster, like after this period where investors are thinking, but they're growing deal flow, just waiting for making decisions. So we think it will come back stronger after the pandemic.
Marie, I don't know if you wanted to stick going to questions, or I have a couple more I'd be willing to ask Mariana, but you kind of lead the way.
Oh, go for it. Enjoying all the sound bites from you. I think one more thing, because there are very great questions in the chat as well. If you could add where you're from, it helps a little bit for context, because we do have a wonderfully global audience. So if you could pop in your country there as well, that'd be great. But no, Matt, if you want to ask Mariana a few more questions, and then we'll open it to our panelists in a moment as well.
Yeah, no, I think a final thing to touch on is just glass half full perspective. What are some things that could be silver linings that you see for both Agrosmart and Brazilian agriculture as a whole? Kind of what excites you most for the coming season, as well as for the next year as a whole?
Okay. So I think I'm excited to see real-time change. I think like we are advocates, right? As TFF investors, like we advocate so much. And now we see people doing what we want them to do. And even though sometimes it's because of a forced and bad thing, it's still good because they will change and agriculture will be better afterwards. So I'm happy with this whole trend on the valorization of sustainability. And I'm personally excited in Agrosmart because we decided, we understand that the market needs consolidation. Like there's too many ag techs doing more or less the same thing with more or less the same traction and investment level. And we believe like the whole agriculture market is consolidating itself and the multinationals are bringing their own platform. And the market's so big and spread that we need to be stronger to be able to actually grow and like build a worldwide company. So we decided we would bet on an M&A strategy. So Agrosmart decided like we will acquire and merge with other startups that are complementary with us in terms of product features and geographies and so on. So like we are starting a new fundraising round, a convertible round in the moment for doing 2 M&As. Like we are already screening 10 companies, 2 of them with term sheets out. So we really would like to make it happen. Like some of them are in Argentina, others in other countries in Latin America. So we really are moving into that, and we are doing the convertible round to be able to do 1 or 2 M&As and then raise a more big Series B to be able to consolidate the market. The first strategy is focused in LATAM, as like we're already a big play here and we want to consolidate and position there, and then to take a next step global. So that's what makes me very excited. I think as an entrepreneur, it's a big step and it's a big dream, and I feel renovated because I really believe that's what we need. Like farmers need integrated solutions. They need to connect different dots. And like we were talking about a chain, and it's a chain. So we really believe that by doing that, we'll be able to deliver more value across the supply chain.
Yeah, super.
What about you? Well, what do you see? And what do you think about my thesis?
that is super exciting.
As an investor, maybe you can give me part of my convertible round.
Well, hey, we'll have to talk about that. I think there's definitely going to be that recurring theme where a lot of startups that are either complementary or haven't quite got the market penetration they initially hoped, but they could see if there's the right partnership or acquisition could really bring them to the forefront of a lot of producers they originally or currently don't have the network to connect with. I see that a lot right now with several of the large irrigation companies, as well as some of the sensor companies they're either partnering with remotely or just right in their own backyard. I think more and more ag techs are recognizing, all right, we have a core competency in our initial group of users, but what would it take to actually scale this to our initial thoughts of how big we could take the company? The industry as a whole hasn't seen as many exits as we initially thought we would, say 7 to 10 years ago. And I think part of that is what you mentioned, the adoption rate is growing, but it's going to need some key partnerships. So it'll be fun to see how it develops in both of our countries. So yeah, very interesting.
Agreed.
There was an interesting question that came in from Nicholas. Nicholas asked, how can we cope with connectivity, carbon measurements on soil with sensors? And in the same time, having this technology, what is a key assessment going on with the microbiome necessary for soil carbon sequestration? So I think there's and this might be different for Brazil, but in the US, this is increasingly an area of focus that is more and more important for several big corporations, as seed companies, as well as ag startups. And carbon sequestration is increasingly a focus for a lot of grain farmers right in my own backyard, right here in Nebraska, because they're tracking this, and even policymakers are tracking it. So I'm curious, Mariana, what are you seeing as far as the key metrics that farmers are either being incentivized to tracking or are tracking on their own? And are there any startups that have really caught your eye, maybe you guys are up to this, of being kind of the key player in carbon tracking?
So there is many challenges when we look about carbon and what is considered valid or what is not. So I think like there is in the industry, and that's what part of the alliance is doing, like decide what's a good carbon, like what's the quality of the carbon, can that be accounted or not? So I think before we decide what we measure and how we measure, we first have to decide what will be considered valid, because otherwise like we just go in a way and it won't be recognized as a way of impact. In that sense, like I think that's what we are as a nation, like as a global understanding, like trying to improve frameworks and understanding on carbon credits and quality of carbon credits. I agree that there's many ways of improving measurements, from tracking the activities in the field with field notebooks, with sensor measurement, and so on. I agree with Nicolas that we need to rebuild somehow like our technology stack to be able to do that. Like even if we look to soil sensors today, there are so many limitations and so many problems that I understand that even if we evolve to be able to measure locally, it will be impacted. So what farmers and the community here is still doing is just like keep track of all the climate data and all of the activity in the field to be able to use traditional methodologies of carbon footprint. And that's where we are today. And there is a lot of discussion already in what's valid and what's not, and what's a good behavior, what is a best practice, because we are redefining the whole agriculture process. So it's really hard to tell when there is no baseline and no benchmark. So I think that's where we are yet as an industry, opposed to already have like deployed solutions to measure the impact. Each one have a different framework, a different methodology. Indigo even have like their own patent on methodology of calculating carbon sequestration, but it's still open for discussion. Not everyone agrees with it. So like, I think we are still in the concept of what we all understand to be possible and to be valid, so we can focus on the technology. And I think that's what I'm trying to do with Agrosmart as a role, is like understand what's going to be defined. And for each gap of things we cannot define because we don't know, how can we measure and how we can bring data to be able to do that. In today, what we do is like measure all the climate conditions and if you know in the field activities, so we can contribute more realistic to those calculations. Before, like if you get like a carbon footprint from a food company, they would estimate how much water they were saving, they would estimate how much input they were using, and that's the change. And like you stop estimating anything and you actually know what you did in the field, and then you can do a better calculation. It still is a calculation, it's not proven done.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you mentioned Indigo. I mean, I saw a quote from one of their spokesperson. They admit it's like our benchmarks, we understand that these will change over time, and as we have more information, the expectation is we will have a better idea of what is a good benchmark. We have a broad and diverse group on the panel, so maybe it's worth opening it up to them.
Totally.
Whether it be on this question or a previous question that Mariana or myself may have talked about. Any additional thoughts from the panel members?
Perhaps Anna can talk about the dairy industry in Brazil and the pandemic, because I heard it's quite hard because the milk has short shelf life as well.
Yeah, sure. I was actually thinking about put up some spice on this conversation, because till now it was very mind-blowing. I saw that Christine is very excited on chat because we talked about very important topics. But I came from different backgrounds, and we have dealing with different problems because we work with the milk chain. And like 3 weeks ago or 4 weeks ago, we created a WhatsApp group with dairy industry owners and collaborators. And we started to help them with small tips and basic tips about digital marketing and branding and management, because this was, they lack this kind of knowledge. But we saw that in all this, the milk chain, the milk producers are the ones that are really suffering the high impact of this new consumer behavior due to the pandemic, right? And we saw like here in the US, the milk producers are literally discarding liters and liters of milk. So this is very, very sad. So like each one of these dairy industries normally have like 200 milk producers that are very small. But the problem here isn't really the connectivity. Most of the small producers has like a cell phone working, so they can use their carrier mobile phone. So how could us, and I want to provoke this because we need help to thinking about solutions, but how could we impact these milk producers? Because it's not about the connectivity, but it's a lot of people that it's somewhat non-tech friendly. they are still doing things like their father did or like their grandfather did, and they aren't really open-minded to try new technologies or new ways to do things. But all the economy in these small milk producers are totally concentrated on this production. So how could we help? What could we do to try to show new scenarios and other ways to do things? I don't know.
Yeah, I'm curious, just for context, and we're seeing this a lot in the U.S. Has consolidation is one of the trends that Mariana brought up. Has consolidation impacted the dairy industry pretty strongly in South America as well?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we have this consumer behavioral change, like people are preferring more mature cheese or things they can stock. So most of the I don't know how to say this in English, it's very specific, but you have problems like with the logistics, because most of cities are having are closing their borders. So the dairy industry can send their products for another states or another cities, and the truck drivers hasn't the logistical spots like to have lunch and to rest a little. So it's about the logistical, it's about the milk prices, it's about the kind of products they can produce and really sell.
Yeah, actually, if I can join into that, I would be interested to see how potentially the effects or the methods and strategies that have to be adapted in order to bounce back a little bit from this pandemic, how they can actually help to make the food system more inclusive, and also what you understand as an inclusive food system. So you've been talking a little bit about consolidation, Matt, but is consolidation, is that going towards a more inclusive food system, or is that going towards more of a corporate food system where, you know, instead of 9,000 hectares being owned by 9,000 smallholders, you have 9,000 hectares being owned by one corporate producers? So I wanted to hear a bit more on what your take is with regards to consolidation of food system versus smallholders. And then probably something that follows up from there as well. Does the required faster uptake on digital technology actually leave some of these non-consolidated producers behind, because suddenly everything jumps onto the digital tools, and you know, the consolidated big corporates have they have a leg up on that? So I wondered how much that then starts to leave certain people behind and actually make the food system less inclusive, because suddenly everything is focusing on digital.
Yeah, no, I think you're, and maybe it's a bit unfortunate, but I think you're right. I mean, and this is more anecdotal, not firsthand accounts, but in the US, it definitely is the latter. Like you said, it is consolidation. This is when I'm talking about the dairy industry. There's increased consolidation. They probably can do better technological adaptation because they have the bandwidth. They have maybe a person that's, I don't want to say a head of innovation, but someone that's kind of the go-to point person for trialing and implementing new technology, and something a small family dairy farm could never dream of. So is that inclusive? Probably not. Is it bringing the scale that the groceries or restaurants desire? It seems to, but that was pre-COVID. And then additionally, as supply chains have been impacted, now there's pretty terrible stories of these now scaled up dairy production facilities having to dump a lot of milk. So it's a big question. I definitely don't have the answer for this call, but I think you're looking at it in the right way, where does scale and consolidation, does it actually mean less inclusivity? And what does that mean for the common smallholder farmer around the world? That is a big question, and it is fair to be concerned.
Yes, on the other hand, if we look like on successful cases of bringing access to smallholders, they are usually played by a larger consolidated company. So like, I think it's phases. Like first you isolate, because then you leave some people behind, but then you are able, if you have goodwill, of course, to engage them back. So if we look, all of the multinationals today have commitments of only sourcing from smallholders. So like you might consolidate and isolate to become big, but then once you're big, you are able to impact back by engaging and sourcing from the small ones. So what I'm sure is like, we need someone to group or like to connect the smallholder farmers. And if it's not consolidation, then we need an alternative. And I see Christine comments here, and I agree, like it can be other companies, it can be someone else, but someone else should play that role of bringing them together so they can access the stuff and learn and benchmark. And sometimes it's a cooperative, but to be sincere, there is also abuse of power in cooperatives. There's corruption in cooperatives. So it's not like just because you're not a private corporation that you will be good. Sometimes the government could play that role, but there is also abuse in governments. And in most of the time, they don't play the role correctly as they should, because they are afraid of failure, because they are more worried about elections than about the impact that they will have. So they avoid taking risks that will damage their image. So I love your debate and your insights. And I feel very curious, because what I think is like, we cannot leave them behind. So maybe what's our roles as startups, as also not consolidating small part or like platforms, to start bringing these pieces together. And that's where I think COVID helped create a word frame that we are not alone. And it doesn't matter if you're in a rich country or in a poor country, like we will affect each other if we don't take care of ourselves. So maybe that brings us as together as a society on how to worry and engage and impact for everyone. So I think it makes us think on the collective and not leave anyone behind.
Mm-hmm.
That's perfect. I could agree more, because it's a very educational role, because we have to be able to teach these small producers, these small farmers, how they can start to thinking about the whole farm thing as a business. And most of them don't do it. Most of them don't follow their metrics or understand how they could make more money or improve their margins. So it's a very educational role, and it has to be really friendly and really a one-on-one thing, because it's a very difficult role to play, but it's exactly that. I totally agree. You're muted.
No, I just wanted to say something before, like we even change the topic. I read someone's questions if the solutions for the dairy industry would, instead of making milk, making cheese. Like in our region, I am from the same region that Raquel. It happened that it's very strong, and then for not losing the milk, they had to make cheese. Otherwise, they would just throw it away. But then if everyone makes cheese, the price drops and they don't pay the costs. So like right now, dairy producers cannot cover their production costs.
Just to make a quick point following the discussion. So, I mean, when I have discussions with people on the impact of COVID, so basically not just on farmers, but on the entire food chain, one thing that comes up is that the positive impact, I mean, it's still too early to, give results of what is or what isn't, but we do realize that we may have a situation where the food chain for some time may move towards a local food system, which means that people will have to purchase, consumers will now purchase what is being grown locally. The advantage for this, I believe, is that it's time for, like we're talking about processing, so turning milk into cheese, is that we have to find ways, especially in developing countries, to empower farmers to process what they're producing. Because especially in sub-Saharan Africa, you have problem of post-harvest losses. They harvest, they lose a lot on the farm. But what if we could have, so this is why I like TFF, what if we could have technologies or simple small-scale machines that could enable the farmers to process? Because when you look at, with a situation like Corona tells you that perishable products are not the way. We cannot depend on fresh tomatoes, and especially where now we have another situation where the lockdown, which happened also, which started around after February, and then in most places it was the time when the rainy season begins. So you're looking at a situation where farmers have also missed the opportunity to start production. you know, when the rains come, because it's mostly rain fed. And so then what's the way forward? Assuming we have more processed foods, could this also be a way? So personally, following the discussions, I think that we need to do more collaboration, and I like that this came up with cooperatives. It may not be the best always, but I think now, after Corona, in my personal opinion, farmers will need to really form cooperatives. They need to only move forward with cooperatives. In Europe, for example, there's the problem of where the migrant workers cannot come in. How do you harvest the produce? It's such a short time. And one of the observers or the participants was asking this question: is there any technology? Is there something that can help? It's too sudden, you know. Corona is just puts your mind to this global food system where you realize that such a little shock makes the whole system so vulnerable. And so we have to really, really think forward. I think a lot of it brings us to a point where we realize now with such discussions that we haven't really looked at a lot of things. So I personally feel that collaboration, so through these cooperatives, will help a lot moving forward, and also to look at the point of localizing food systems where possible. We've been very dependent on a global food system, which is now very vulnerable to the shock and to this pandemic and all of that. So I think we can also maybe subsequent discussions talk about how local can we make the food system, what initiatives can we bring to help farmers now, especially now, like one big problem is irrigation. There will be a problem in sub-Saharan Africa. Farmers will not be able to produce to the end because they have missed the rainy season, which is the major one also, you know. So they will start production in the middle. And yeah, and also one thing I did realize from this pandemic is that in countries like Italy, which supplies a lot of food products to Europe, Italy has one of the highest rates of the aged in the world. So you're talking about older persons. And by statistics, these are the people who are in the farming communities. The farmers are mostly older people. When I do my documentation and things, you realize that farmers are old people. We hardly meet people who are under 30 in the farming communities. And if this is a situation where there's such a pandemic that is affecting the aged, then it brings a question of how do we now empower the youth to go into farming? So we have to now think of new farmers more or less. I don't know if you get what I'm driving at. We now have to think of new farmers more or less. So not to talk so long and give the floor to someone else.
That's amazing thoughts, Hime. Like makes us for sure think, and there will be consequences now of losing the timing.
Yeah, I think also a lot of hard conversations will need to be had about what is needed locally, and both on the processing side and bringing it directly to the consumer, but also on the pure supply side of. Originally what was thought was like, well, we need to produce this much to scale and export at this minimum quality amount, rather than what is actually needed in our local neighborhood or community markets. The age point, I think that's super interesting that you bring up. That I think this pandemic really highlights what regions around the world are having younger people going to farmer, and just as important, what regions are not. So that's a big concern on my mind. That's a good point.
I think that a lot of these points you raised, Ohima, we had experience with as well. We are working with farmers, smallholder farmers in Kenya, and mainly cooperatives actually. And we've had a few requests. So we have the ability to deliver training via SMS. We've deliberately chosen to use a feature phone technology rather than a smartphone technology. And SMS messages is something it's very common in Kenya because of the M-Pesa system. So everyone basically uses SMS for payments and USSD and all that. And we've had some requests as well where cooperatives wanted to start training their members on growing quick growing food like spinach and brassica to help them provide themselves with enough food, because the markets were shut. So they weren't actually able to go to the markets anymore and buy the food that they needed. So they might be tea farmers who would sell their tea and then buy vegetables, which they weren't able to anymore. So now they were looking for training to actually get advice on how to grow quick vegetables like spinach and things like that. So that was quite an interesting insight as well, which was specifically related to the to the pandemic. And then there's lots on diversification as well. There's lots of beekeeping that's currently promoted as a crop diversification method where any farmer can go into beekeeping with a little bit of investment, maybe a small credit. And it's something that pays off very, very quickly, because honey is quite a high value crop, and anyone who's got a little bit of experience with farm and managing, I guess managing a beehive can start producing honey. So there's quite a lot of interesting movements there. And then again, focusing on a technology that is a bit more accessible than digital platforms or anything that's internet-based. Using SMS, I think, is quite a good way to capture a larger audience, specifically if it comes to differences in age as well. And as you say, the majority of farmers is probably 40 or older. So yeah, there's a lot of questions, I think, around providing resilience through accessible systems. Yeah,
that's a good point, Gabriel, and excited to hear the progress you guys are making, specifically in Kenya.
Yeah, it's going well. I'm quite happy that we were able to provide some value.
Gabriel, and on that point, just like because Matt made me remember about that, like being in Kenya and like you being located in different places, how do you plan, like also to have another ag tech perspective, as I already talked, how do you plan to keep up your operations and your follow-ups? How do you feel like not being able, because I imagine you traveled often, right? As I do probably. So how do you plan to continue your operations during, we don't know how long we will stay without being able to cross borders?
Yeah, so actually on the point earlier, face-to-face meetings seem to be incredibly important for a lot of the cooperative staff. So we've had cases where we've had to delay the project because we weren't able to meet the staff face-by-face to initiate the project. The virtual meetings weren't enough, or just like the WhatsApp exchange. So that has delayed a few things and has got us thinking as well on how we can, mitigate that or basically overcome that problem. Is it a case of maybe using video calls, or like how can you continue with work even though these sort of barriers come up? And we're trying to work a lot with local colleagues as well. So we started working with 2 Kenyans now who are visiting. They did visit cooperatives before the lockdown, which also makes it, I think, is a lot easier to manage something that's, there's cultural differences, there's the sheer physical distance between the UK and Kenya, and also just the I think providing a more of a local how would you say that? Someone to locally explain what the project is and support it from a local perspective, I think is quite important. So yeah, the traveling is definitely going to be a problem for us. But currently, because we're working with text messages, we can do a lot simply by using text messages. We can send messages here from the UK. We have them translated. We work locally with people to help us there. And we have been able to make progress, even though the physical movement is so limited.
Really happy to hear.
Thanks.
Well, hey, before we wrap up, any final thoughts, either from you, Mariana, from the panel as a whole? I know we've got maybe a minute or two left.
I just kind of wanted to say that it was really kind of amazing getting to hear all of y'all's perspectives. And Gabriel, I work a lot, I'm still a student, but I work a lot with kind of hypotheticals on being able to improve, I guess, technologies and communication in rural countries or rural areas in Africa. And it's really kind of great to see your perspective on kind of how your company's been doing, because we face a lot of how do we get, there's obviously a big gap between where traveling and all that kind of stuff. And so it was really kind of great seeing how y'all have kind of gone about it. And I'm definitely going to take some of those ideas home.
Thank you, and thanks a lot for your insights, Mariana and Matt. It's really good.
Well, excellent. Thank you to our panelists and for everybody joining for this open communication and conversation. One thing, if you have additional interest in digging into this more, TFF is doing their COVID Collaboration Collective. I would encourage each of you to check it out on the TFF website, because it's really just further digging into a lot of the conversations that we just had a couple minutes to touch on, and what does it mean for increased localized food systems and how we as a community can better support and be more inclusive. So a pleasure for me to join in this conversation, and really look forward to digging into more with each one of you. So thank you all for your time.
Well, guys, I also would like to thank, I would like specifically to thank Christine, because I think like she's also an entrepreneur with a dream, and she brought us together, and like I think it makes us feel part of a tribe. And I think we really need that sense of belonging and someone to guide like that vision and make it real, so we can all collaborate and make change. So I thank her for being a catalyzer of all of these people from all over the world changing the food chain.
I almost don't want to jump in because I kind of want to leave it on that wonderful message. But indeed, thank you all for your amazing insights and for open sharing as well. Matt already kind of rounded it up beautifully. So we do have this COVID Collaboration Collective. So do check it out on the Superfood website. And this session was recorded and will be made available with some notes as well. But just in case you weren't there for the entire one, so what we've kind of covered was the effect of COVID currently on the farmers, kind of the role of connectivity and what the investment landscape looked like briefly as well. And I guess we have a lot of questions for what the future will bring. So whether, you know, we're going to, the role, what is the role of cooperatives going to be? What role is consolidation going to play? What about the age of farmers? How is that going to affect how the future pattern here looks like? And then what is food conservation going to be like? Do we need to move more to non-perishables? And are supply chains going to be more local? So that's kind of a super quick wrap up. Thanks so much for joining us, and do join us in our future live sessions. We have quite a few coming up, so have a look on our website. And thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.